and I think that's really very important for us to try and cover in our little community here, because I think that I mean, I was talking to one of our community. I won't say who it is, but he's actually working very closely with the HSE, and he's been discussing with them in quite some considerable detail what the regulator or what the regulators are going to have to be doing. And he was saying that I think 50% of the projects that have gone forward to stage 1 gateway review have been refused.
I saw, yeah, I saw an article on that. Yeah, interesting.
50%.
Yeah.
And he was saying that the new the secondary legislation that's coming through, there's going to be another 30 new regulations. That's on top of everything else we've got.
Yeah.
So in my view, coming back to the point that you're making, I think we've got far too much data. And I think we need to collectively try and interpret that into some tangible answers. And one of the challenges that I think I've sort of arrived at is that for us to be able to go from data to information, what we need to do is curate questions. Because the questions, if we get the questions right, then the answers will then make sense, if that makes sense. I was talking a couple of weeks ago down at Digital Construction Week to one of the senior guys at BIM Object, and we're talking about how we can get to standardized data, and he was telling me that within BIM Object he did a piece of work that scanned across their products, and they found 280 different ways of describing width. Yeah. Now that, and they're not going to be able to change that, because BIM Object's model is to reflect whatever the manufacturer wants to describe, however they want to describe their products.
I think the context is the key in here, because
exactly.
That makes sense once there is a context.
That's Jarek, that's exactly where I'm coming from as well, and I'm going to be explaining a couple of the things that we're doing, and certainly the exercise that we did at DCW is part of that. I think that's exactly what we need to do. We need to be capturing context and also the knowledge that's needed, so that we can curate the right questions, so we can say when you want to know that width, what question is it actually answering? Yeah. Because there's a lot of people that I've come across that don't realize that IFC doesn't actually give you a unit of measure, or how it's supposed to be expressed, because that's always a local, national implementation. And that generally, I mean, Joe's far more familiar with this than me, but that's right, isn't it, Joe? It's the national annex, if they're done, that then interprets that. But if you've got a value, it could be in millimeters, it could be in meters.
I was kind of laughing because the number of arguments or conversations I have about Kobe and is it GBP for British pounds, or is it sterling, or is it we can't even agree that currency. Yeah.
Daz, I think you need to call us to order.
Hi there, morning there. Thank you. I thought one of the things that I had on my list was whether George is able to give a bit of feedback from the digital construction week. So it sounded like really productive sort of sessions. So I wasn't able to attend because I was off work. And then I guess the only two other things that I had, George, was just to, with the team, agree whether there's any further, I guess, clarification of the queries that we kind of collated that should then go into like the work streams. But there's anything else that we needed to do on that, or were we happy as a group that those questions were suitably sensible / detailed enough to kind of push on to the next stage? So they were the kind of two main things that I wanted to sort of really cover today. So if you could start off with the roundup, and then we can just agree about the questions that we raised.
Great. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do. There's a number of people on this call that were actually at the event, but what I'm going to do, if I may, is I'm just going to explain the background of it. I think everybody knows that we've been going through this exercise for the last couple of years to try and create standardized libraries that can then be used in different software applications. And the way in which we're actually using that within Active Plan is to create these standardized libraries that can then be used in the different parts of the process, so that we can actually create that throw through. And the result of that is that we can then hold information about, let's say, a door that's installed, and then to be able to identify whether information's missing or not, and then to be able to present back to the fire authorities, for example, a simple plan that then lets them see how things are working. The work that we've been doing in that area, there's lots of different activities going on, and the ones circled in red are the ones that we've been involved with. And one of the big things that's come out, and I'm finding it surprising that so few people are aware of this. This is the Defective Premises Act, which is part of the new legislation that's going through. The Defective Premises Act has been in place since '72, but it's not really been as significant as it is now. It's being applied in a very different way. I think the liability now going forward is for 15 years, but what they're doing is making it retrospective, so that there's liabilities going back 30 years. So I think there's going to be massive numbers of cases and things like that around that, but it is something that we need to, it's a big driver, I think, and we can see here things like mandatory occurrence reporting and things like that, and all of this is going to require a very different sort of regime in terms of information management. And if we then look at what the Act, which is now in place, is coming, we're going through at the moment the sort of secondary legislation, the detail about what's going to be required, and importantly, the data has got to be structured and digital. The new Act, I looked at this last week, and the terminology that they're using is prescribed information, and that's the level of detail that we've currently got. Now, what I think most of you know is that I've been leading I've been working in the L&Q-led Golden Thread initiative, but there's 10 work streams that have been collaborating to provide what's needed, and across the groups, we've actually got what information the various different teams say is going to be needed, and this information has gone back to the department. So the information that we've got at the moment isn't prescriptive, but it certainly informs the industry thinking about what's going to be needed. And obviously, my responsibility. The group I've been chairing is the Asset and Survey Information Group. And what we were advised to do was not focus on the asset information per se. It was looking at what are the risks and how can you then manage against those risks happening. We also created some outputs to say what needed to be in the documents that needed to be available, the information that needed to be available to produce the safety case, the tools for visual records, and also, and this is the most significant thing, and that is that a prescriptive specification needs to be agreed at the end of work stage 4, so for Gateway 2, and that has a massive impact on M&E and any specialist design elements. And this is what the other thing that the process group did within the team. They took the REBA planner work and then overlaid the gateways against that as to what the building safety regulator was going to be dealing with at each stage. And this really helps, I think, clarify that the design has got to be completed by the end of work stage 4. So the challenge that we've got in terms of the data side of things is quite significant. So we're at the moment, people are accepting, and I think we probably are going to need to, because we're on a journey, that a lot of the documents or a lot of the information is going to be in a document format. But the problem with documents is that you don't know whether the information that you need, like fire rating, is actually in the document or isn't. And therefore, you've got to have humans look at this data sheet, for example, to interpret what the fire rating is of that particular door. And the challenge with that, you can't, there's no technology that enables you to automatically read that, because this is one door supplier's data sheet, this is another, and the way in which they're describing fire rating is completely different. And that's why I said earlier, if we can standardize the questions, then we can standardize the answers. And here's another one. So there's just very different ways. And if people have got to manually read and interpret data sheets to know whether something is going to work within their design, I think that's going to be a problem going forward. There's some fantastic data. This is something that was provided for DCW. It's from Forza, which is really good detail, but again, it's not in a machine readable format. And you know, as designers, you'd need to read that and understand whether it actually fits your requirements. Even the test certificates, you know, that it's possible that those could be machine readable, but it's a lot better if we can put those into data templates that can then be automatically tested and validated. You know, so here we've got some of the information that Abloy provided for us for DCW, which is their data sheets. But when I say almost machine readable, you've still got to read this and interpret the information. So here, for example, you've got various different fields that have got multiple answers in them. And that isn't something that would be easily interpreted. So we need to transform that. And they've been going about doing that in this sort of format. And this is using the type of templater technology that we've been discussing in the past. Everybody thinks, obviously, and not this group, that the data's in the BIM. One of the challenges is that we've got so many data dictionaries that are being used for different purposes. So, you know, obviously we've got IFC, we've got MBS, we've got BIM4Housing, NRM. ETIM, which is the manufacturer's data set. That's what they use. Distributors use. So people like Travis Perkins. We've also got things like declarations of performance, environmental product declarations. The CPA is creating manufacturers' data, and also we've got others like the new fiery data sets. So if we look at IFC just for a door, you can see we've got arguably an overwhelming amount of information that has been suggested that should be included in a model. And we've all seen models that have got loads of shared parameters against them that are empty. And so here's some examples. That this is IFC, but if you then use the MBS examples from the toolkit, you've got a completely different set. Not completely different, rubbish. It's probably a lot of the same information, but it's described in a slightly different way in some cases. You've then got NRM. This is ETIM, which is the one I was saying earlier. So fire resistance, for example, that is described in a different way. Very good, by the way, because they've got GUIDs against all of the properties. So we can really use this information, but it's not the same. And the work's been going on. ETIM have been working with Building Smart to relate this back to IFC as well. Here we've got SFG 20. Here we've got the sustainability information. So this is the basically the stuff that we need for embodied carbon to calculate. And here we've got the new standards. So again, a different way of describing fire-related information. Now, there's no value. A lot of work's been going on, over the years to try and standardize all this stuff, get everybody to agree to use the same terminology. But I've come to the conclusion that that's impossible because, people need their information in that different way because they've got a different perspective. So one of the ways that we're addressing this, these are called data dictionaries, effectively. And there's a new ISO standard for interconnecting all these data dictionaries. So what we've done is created the templater. We did this some years ago, which allows you then to curate information, and then you can then tie it back into product data. So it then becomes a little bit of a sort of Rosetta Stone that allows us to hold all this information together. So coming back to the way that the HSE has recommended that we should be looking at this process is to say you've got risks, you've got treatments, as they call them, to prevent the risk. You've then got asset types that go to make up those treatments, and then you've got the information about those. So the exercise that we did at DCW was to say, let's look at the risk of the spread of smoke and the impact of compromised fire escape routes. And the treatments that we identified, there's compartmentation, detection, smoke control, and evacuation. And the important thing is that all of these things need to work for the risk to be mitigated. If the fire doors work perfectly, unless the penetration seals perform, then there's no point. We've still got the problem, and there's always going to be smoke coming out. So therefore, we've got to make sure the AOVs work. So in the case of the compartmentation, there's a range of different things that all need to perform in a joined up way to be able to ensure that the compartmentation works. And therefore, we need to make sure that the information, in this case it's IFC, but whatever the parameter is actually being provided. So the answers need to be there so that we can automatically test and validate them. As you know, and a lot of you have contributed to these, we've had our subject matter experts work in the work streams to in the work streams to actually come up with what information do we need about fire doors or AOVs or whatever. So we've got that as data, but for me, there's just too much of it. It's all really valuable stuff, but at the moment, it's not in a way that we can easily consume. So what we've been trying to do, talking about what Jarek was saying earlier, context, everybody's got a different view. And that's what we did really at the event. So we had 5 tables there that Will Perkins is leading there. That was the manufacturing group. And so we had a manufacturing group, a design group, operations, construction, and development. And the development group, for example, they called me over about 15 minutes into their conversation. They said, we really need somebody here from operations. So one of the guys from operations got up and went over to the development group. This is, by the way, something quite new. This is called an in-person meeting, rather than the common way of doing it when on Teams. So the task that we had was to take a particular student accommodation, residential building. That was the scope, and we had this as the example. So the idea was that, you know, a fire breaks out in a kitchen, you know, perhaps on a cooker, maybe doing chips or something like that. It catches fire, creates smoke, and what do we need to do to ensure that the tenants can escape? Have we got the right information about the compartments and the AOVs, etc.? And what we did, we then took the information, for example, about the firewalls, for example, and we tried to break down. These were the outputs that we've got. We've now got these from the guidance that we've got on the black box. So we've interpreted these into information sets, and then we've tried to look to see who's probably the primary creator of that information. So in other words, who's responsible for it, and then who's maybe consuming it. Now, possibly RACI was a bit too complicated for this, I don't know. But what we're really trying to do is see how we can say, how can we turn this data into questions that people can answer and be responsible for? One of the challenges Jarek picked up was that we were using the term supplier. And one of the challenges with everything is terminology, and it can be very confusing. And this was one of the feedbacks that Jarek gave me on the day, to say, you know, what is a supplier? And also we did some work but this is, you know, some examples that we've been picking up along the way to explain the sorts of things that happen. I mean, Sharon, who's on the call at the moment, she's given us loads of examples of where penetration seals have not been done properly. And I remember that Jarek and Paul White and Paul McSolly were talking about how the services can be re-engineered so that there's not the likelihood of, or the same possibilities as the sorts of mistakes. So that's it really. I wanted to Yeah, is that helpful? Stunned silence.
George,
It is. What I would say on one of the items that sort of comes up time and time again that it doesn't really seem to be captured anywhere is how different or specified components work within their specified construction. So quite often we have issues with dampers within partition walls as a classic example, where the test that or the wall construction that the damper is tested on isn't actually the wall construction that it's being specified within, and it's then almost assumed when the specification is received and during that process, and you can look at it as in its coordination between contractors, but that's really too late in many situations. So quite typically what we find is that dampers are being installed in partitions that they're not tested within. And this is a fairly common occurrence, and it's almost that connection that we need to be somehow placed electronically earlier in the process. So if a damper is specified in a wall, is there test information showing that it performs within that wall, and therefore is that specification correct?
Absolutely, Matt. What I mean, my sort of journey with this, and one of the things that we discovered from the round table, and you were there, so you can probably give much stronger feedback even than my sort of, because you were actually working in one of the groups. But one of the things that we discovered was that that sort of the number of variables are huge, and therefore we need to try and simplify the way we communicate those complex discussions. And one way of doing that, I feel, is to actually capture those types of scenarios, so that we can say, well, under these circumstances, this particular, I think it's like Jarek was saying earlier, the context. I think what we need to be able to do is say, right, based on our experience, this is the possible thing that we need to mitigate against.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, let's test the design earlier to see if it's going to respond in that way. And the critical thing is that we need to be looking at that damper in the context of the wall and in the context of the other things that are going to impact it. All too often, we've got, it seems to me that we've got the architect focusing on the wall. Yeah, we've got the M&E engineer focusing on the damper, right? And then it then ends up with Sharon having to mop up the fact that, you know, they've got to find a penetration seal that won't fit because the services have been moved in the wrong place, and therefore it's that sort of joined up working. And I've been talking with a couple of people who are involved with digital twins. Now, I'm very cautious of digital twins because I think there's so much, to be honest, bullshit around the way people are interpreting it, because there's a 3D model and then all of a sudden there's a digital twin. But I actually think that the tools and the learning that we've got from that is emerging from digital twins is actually something that we could use, because the way I'm looking at digital twins is simulation. So if we can capture through our community what things we know can happen, those can be built into rules and they can be built into scenarios that can then be run against a design at the early stage, as you're saying, and therefore we can both test to see if it's going to work, and perhaps more importantly, I say more importantly, perhaps more importantly, to be able to show to the new regulators that it's been considered.
Okay. If I can give you, because to be honest, I'm not sure how this could be picked up via sort of digital information, and I'm hoping that someone involved in the meeting will have more insight than I do on that aspect. But if I can give you a couple of examples of items where this sort of typically occurs. So, one of which is, I don't know whether everyone has seen the intumescent deflection head seals. They're sort of an intumescent sort of horseshoe material which goes over the top of the partition. The idea is to so that board fillets aren't required at high level. With a gap, you just have this intumescent sort of a seal, if you like, over the top. Now, we had this, it was specified on a project recently, all over the entire job. It was only when we were asked to become involved and have a look at the information that we found out that it had only been tested, or the manufacturer had only tested it onto a 120-minute twin frame wall with 2 layers of board on each side, which you would very rarely find in the majority of buildings. So, I mean, party walls are generally an hour, so it wasn't a common construction. It was being used in single frame walls, 60 minutes, 30 minutes, 120 minutes, and the test information didn't cover it for that. Another perhaps more serious example, we were working on a medical research facility recently, and the damper that was specified there was tested in a single frame, 120-minute wall, 130 millimeters thick, and was being installed in a twin frame construction with 60 minutes fire rating. Now, not only did the test information not cover inclusion of the damper within that construction, but there was no detailing for it, because you've got no, the twin frame obviously is only boarded on one side of each frame. So you've got effectively 2 linings back to back. And when you're capping off around that damper, you've then got an area where it's spanning between the frames. So that entire situation wasn't covered by the damper manufacturer. And we entered a situation where we were putting forward hypothetical details. We were discussing with the project buyer consultant, and it was all on the basis of untested information. We had to have assessments done at the 11th hour, which was really sort of far too late to be looking at that sort of complexity of information. Now, obviously, I'm sort of, where we were involved, I was quite happy that we managed to resolve that. But there are thousands of projects that we're not involved in, and I'm sure that kind of thing goes ahead, and nobody knows anything about it. And I'm sure there are many projects out there that have been built like that without that knowledge that it's wrong.
I'm struggling, and I think I'm even going to struggle to put this into words. But there's the data, and I almost see the data as the verification tool. But we've got to be careful not to come away from the competence, not just of the design team in one word, but the individuals, because you can see how the perfect storms come about in terms of, that you may arguably say that a damper has been competently specified by this person, but the architect, who's also very competent, has changed the partition type. So it's how you also move to this kind of, I don't know, almost like a holistic competence, and then tie those two together with the data. My fear is that you see the data as, oh yeah, I've got all this data here, box ticked, done. But sitting behind that is always these levels of competence.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what happens, Mark, quite often is that the question is there, is it tested? Yes, it's tested, tick in the box, but not actually what does that test cover? Is it tested in the different constructions that we've specified it in? So, and you're absolutely right, it is the individual's input that needs to be taken into account. But for example, where we haven't got somebody, we've discussed with contractors, obviously specialist contractors are only involved at a certain stage. They're not involved in the architectural design stage. They don't even know whether they're appointed on the project till quite a late stage. So they're perhaps understandably apprehensive to become too involved. So how do we get that information early on?
That almost goes back to George, what you were saying on your slide, and it's one of the things that I'm most interested in is the impact of worst or best, whichever way you look at it, case scenario, needing to complete the stage 4 design, complete the design, before you essentially approach a sign off for Gateway 2, which then may have a 12-week sign off period. And that, and actually, if you stop and down and talk to colleagues, that sounds wonderful. I mean, why the hell are we, I will openly say that some of our problems on projects come about because we've always had an overlap between stage 4 technical design and stage 5 construction, but we've allowed it to almost sit on top of the other, and in a way, I feel like we've fooled ourselves. We say, well, because we did it last time, we'll push it a bit more and a bit more. And we're designing and building at the same time. So actually, for me, wow, if we could finish the stage 4 design, take a breather, get it signed off, and then start building brilliantly. But then the picture gets even bigger. It's, how will it be acceptable overall from a project viability point of view to start that design earlier? Can that happen? Or to allow it to run later? Where you're operating within a PCSA, where you're trying to confirm, to get to cost certainty, will the client want to actually appoint specialist designers? Because what we normally have in a PCSA is, if we're asked to progress through stage 4 in that period, we'll say, well, hang on, we need to have the specialists on board. Well, that's okay. You can engage with the specialists, but engagement is not the same as actually appointing and designing someone. So the picture suddenly becomes bigger, and that's where I say, it's a big procurement issue, way beyond just the design.
Definitely, and I'll come to you in a second, Daz, but I think that's the critical thing, really, that procurement is the element that we need to bring along with us. And I'm talking with people that are involved in procurement, and they're receptive to change. I think the other thing is this whole thing about risk management and risk transfer, and one of the reasons I perceive that people do procure in that way is because they perceive they're transferring some of the risk and reducing the risk. But actually, they may be potentially, although I'd argue possibly not, but they may be reducing the cost risk, but they're probably impacting on safety risk or the other risks. And therefore, I think if we can look at that in that, and I think you're right. I think we need to potentially, I mean, the fact is we've got no choice, have we? The Building Safety Act is going to change things. So I think we just need to embrace it and then say, well, let's do a lot of the things that we've always wanted to do. Let's use it for that purpose.
There is, and sorry, Des, just to close out on that, there is one thing that worries me, because whilst there's a lot of things that worry me, but whilst I think actually if we could get ourselves in this place that we're completing stage 4 design before construct, brilliant, and there's some hurdles to get over on that. But when you read down through the gateway guidance on the website, whilst it starts off saying Gateway 2 is a go, no-go gateway, which is the context I'm talking from within, when you get towards the bottom of that, it does talk about a staged approach. So they've unfortunately left a little bit of a, well, actually, we can go, and what those stages would be, I don't know. And I can see that being used to move risks in an unfair way around the place.
Absolutely, Daz.
Well, I think Mark, that's those kind of things that we've just talked about Some of the things that I noticed when I read that article that was sent through by Mo, I believe, because it does seem to kind of talk about some element of change management being allowed between Gateway 2 and 3, which, as you say, brings ambiguity, which is always not a great thing. I think the only things I wanted to say was in terms of, as I say, the competency of the design and making sure things are interfacing. Dave sort of mentioned to me last week that obviously there was a guidance that came out about 11 to 18 meter buildings, which are sort of A2 rated, but then anything above that can't have that. Again, bringing a bit of ambiguity where some materials, unless they've been tested on a large scale, can't definitely be used, but if they have been tested, then they can be as assemblies essentially. I think that's the point that you were making, Matt, is that the reality is that we just won't have a certificates for every scenario that we're going to have on sites, especially if they're refurbs, for example, and therefore I don't know, one of the practical things that I can think of as a designer is during, for example, the commenting period, typically we would get shop drawings from the specialist, but the commenting really is kind of either just by the architect or the M&E or structures. But maybe there's a requirement to go back a little bit to, I guess, what would happen pre-digital to a large degree, where we'd actually need commenting from not just the designer, but any other trade that is interfacing with that specialist element, because that is the only way that I can see that level of rigor coming into the build-ups that you mentioned there, for example, in terms of the intermescent foam element, for example. So maybe there's an element of that commenting period that we go through with shop drawings, but doing that obviously at stage 4 as opposed to at stage 5. And so when we get to this sort of coordinated, specified, prescribed build-ups, they've actually gone through the whole thing. Now, obviously, that I'm completely aware that, as Mark, you're saying, that requires a complete change in the procurement. But in a way, the guidelines are the thing that means that we have to change, as you're saying, George. It's in a good way that these requirements have come in. The potential grey areas in the gateway definition, I'm a bit worried about, because that's obviously where people will try and kind of take advantage of that, or try and push things into stage 5 again. And I sort of leads into, I guess, the questions that I kind of sent through last couple of weeks ago, whenever it was, because, like I said, from that document that was issued, I do think, George, if you're having those discussions with the procurement team, it would be good to kind of drill down and say, actually, a bit like what you've done in that diagram for the work stages, to then add on, okay, well, what is this? What sort of change is allowed? Should it be allowed? How long will it take for that change to be approved? Is it 12 weeks? Is it 4 weeks? Is it a bit like an NMA or an MMA? So they were the kind of initial reactions to everything that I've kind of heard, which is, you're right, the design element and the coordination is something that has to be done, and I think more rigorously almost, with interface consultants, specialists, which I don't necessarily think always happens. I get lots of drawings to comment on, but I never see anyone else necessarily adding on to that from the other trades. So that's probably the best way that I can see, the most practical way to eliminate competency specialisms and design issues. But then I just kind of wanted to see whether actually those questions that we developed, I think they capture the things that we're talking about here in terms of the program, the change management, and then the final one in terms of, George, the matrix that you had developed in the workshops about, the RACI thing. If someone is responsible, how do we then feed that back into their DRM, the design responsibility matrix, or their scope of services? Because obviously I think that's my third question that I raised was, it's all well defining them, but actually how do we, as you say, standardize when we say that you are the prescriptive owner of that particular package or element? Do we use Uniclass as the baseline? Do we use something else as the baseline, so that, again, it's being as black and white as we can be in terms of who's responsible at what stage, and that little workflow that you showed looked really sensible, George, in terms of identify the risk, what are the things that impact on that risk, and what specific information is needed. Who's going to provide that? That then obviously has to be captured in an appointment point of view, contractually, within the scope documents. So,
yeah, just picking up on what you're saying, there's a couple of things, if I may interject. One is what you've just said there is interesting, and that is everybody agreeing that we're going to use Uniclass, right? Now that's perfectly logical, but what it does, if you go back to what I was showing earlier, Uniclass is useless for people, for cost managers. Yeah, that's why they've got NRM. Yeah, and therefore we need to be able to hold against a particular asset or a system multiple different references, which from a technology point of view, that's easy for us to do. And therefore you present back to the people that have got that particular level of interest, that particular data set. But what we do need to do, and this is the work that we're working on at the moment with an active plan, is provide smart data. So the smart data can then present itself back to whoever needs that information using the right terminology, the right form, and therefore, that. The other thing I would say is that we're the feedback from the people that know what the HSE are doing or not doing, because at the moment they've got a massive challenge on they've I think it's October 2023 that they've got to have all of this in place. And from a political point of view, they have to deliver safer buildings or enable safer buildings to be delivered. But if they're holding up major schemes because they are not approving them, then that's going to be a problem as well. And therefore they're being very cautious in terms of how they are describing things. And an example was given to me last night was, what does our HRRB mean? In the Act, it is high risk residential buildings. And yet in the HSE's presentations, they've reverted to high rise residential buildings. Now in the Act, it talks about high risk buildings being hospitals. Yeah. There's not very many hospitals that are 18 meters or higher. And our interpretation is that that's because the HSE recognises that they've got a massive responsibility, and they're trying to temper it a little bit. Now, the challenge with that for Bouygues, for example, is that if another incident happens and if a hospital runs into problems, and everybody can go back to the Act and say, look, that was covered. Yeah, Bouygues, why didn't you do it? Or AHR, why didn't you anticipate this? The blame's going to be moving around, isn't it? So I think we need to work on the basis that we need to do it as well as we can, and it's the industry response, I think, that needs to pick up on that.
Just to be a little bit cynical on one thing you said there about the sort of political implications of whether or not, if it's a 12-week period for sign off, and I think 4 weeks been talked about for change, although we don't know what major and minor change is. It does sort of depend on how prescribed the route is to achieve stage 2, because from the perspective of the person signing off the information, the easiest thing in the world is to say that the information wasn't adequate, therefore we'd reset the clock. So there are, maybe a little bit cynical, but there are ways of playing that game from others' point of view.
Absolutely, and I anticipate that is exactly what's going to happen. The other thing is that the way in which they're looking at it is that they, even within the HSE, you've got two very different groups. You've got the people that are looking after CDM or construction, and the people that are looking after safety, and they are different teams. So what I'm hoping we can perhaps do collectively is come up with something that is a practical, viable way of working that then can become a standard practice. The other thing, just picking up on what Matt was talking about earlier, which is the knowledge bit, because really it's Matt's knowledge and experience that has picked up that particular. So that hasn't come necessarily from a manufacturer. It's actually come from your practical experience, isn't it, Matt? That you've looked and you know that you've got to, in this particular context, you need to do something. So one of the things, Anna Matic is with us from Scott Boundrig, and I've been talking with Anna and a couple of other people about digital twins. And one of the terms I've learned over this last year is something called ontologies. Now, ontologies is really the context in which something is being used. That's one way of interpreting it anyway. And therefore, that becomes a method by which we can perhaps capture the experience that Matt and colleagues have got around the, if that's used in that context and those circumstances, then we can capture that as a rule set, and then it becomes reusable. So we're then able to take the data, to give it structure so that it becomes machine readable, and then we can overlay ontologies against that, which then allow us to then achieve the goals.
Yeah.
And that's a big job, but it's something that if we can collectively agree it's worth doing, then we can possibly pull together and get some funding to actually do it, because I think that's what we need. Is that worth exploring? Sorry, Anna.
No, just to add, I mean, basically it would be about working out the patterns of things and the patterns of variations as well, and building ontologies on top of that. So really the digital twin would not be necessarily of the assets of themselves, but of the actual functions and stories within each each building or residential development or whatever. I think it would be something that would be quite big at the start, but then it would get simpler and simpler the more patterns we actually just capture and understand, because once they're inside the digital twin, they can actually work out themselves quite easily.
And the digital twin, as we Anna and I were on with Swaco yesterday, the digital twin, it doesn't need to be a 3D model.
No.
Yeah, it can be a process.
Yeah. It can be a 3D model for those projects that will have a 3D model, but it also can be done on a very simple set of 2D drawings. It's the information that's important. And I think, George, what you were pointing at just before, which is that we will need to have some kind of translator, basically a national translator that can pull together slightly different and also translate into other kind of classifications for different categorizations.
Yeah, the templator that we built with the BRE, where I think most people on the call probably know, we've agreed that we're going to have an instance of that we can use within BIM4Housing, so we can create our own content.
That would be really good.
Obviously, we'll build on content that is already being produced. We're not going to do it from scratch. It's already populated with IFC 4. So we can start with that, but then we can start to overlay other data dictionaries. Again, we've already got in it the environmental product declaration data. The next step with it, this is going to need a bit of development, but not much, is to introduce synonyms. So synonyms are going to make it a lot easier for us to, sort out some of the complexity of people describing the same thing in a different way.
I think when we're talking about some of these variations and avoiding them, one of the major causes of variations, aside from the sort of typical scope gap, i.e. A structural element has been included that isn't in the scope of works of a certain contractor and is required for another contractor's works, and it falls in between the two, and therefore that's then perceived as a variation. Aside from those sort of more sort of common occurrences, one of the items that we find really has the potential to run away in terms of additional costs is where the early stage design information isn't or cannot be accommodated within the construction by the specialist contractor. So where we've got a design and a specification, what's being asked for that cannot be practically completed because the information is conflicting. And again, I'll use an example. I think I may have brought this up before. There's a swimming pool ceiling that we are involved with currently, where a certain level of corrosion resistance is required. For a duration, we've been told a 60-year lifespan, and none of the components, and we can't get any manufacturers to agree to it. What's available cannot achieve what's being requested. And just going on the back of, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail because it's quite involved in detail, but just going on the back of one of Mark's earlier comments, where we've got this sort of stage 3 and then stage 4, I can very sort of conveniently see that being kept in much the same way as it is at the moment, where the stage 3 is complete, gets passed over to the stage 4, where we've got contractual design input, and the contractor is then stuck with it, but is unable to achieve the architectural intent. So we almost need either a loop back round to stage 3, if that does happen, or a point at stage 3 that has to be proven that the intent can be achieved, or we engage with to include the knowledge required to resolve some of those issues at stage 3. And I mean, in a way, that's what I suppose other organisations like ourselves have been pushing to try and do for a while, perhaps from a biased perspective, which is why perhaps it's difficult to get people to listen. But ultimately, when we've had involvement with architects, what we generally find is this sort of common response is that the budget isn't included at the architectural stage. So ultimately, they don't have the budget to engage in any specialist design involvement to resolve some of these issues before it then goes out to contractor design. And of course, then the contractor prices it, lump sums the design. A lot of it is done on an assumption and then can't deliver it.
There's a danger if you open the door of allowing people to go back through stage 3 spatial coordination. I mean, I think we need to work harder on being confident that what we have is spatially coordinated, because you either get the scenario that you're going back through it and it's left, let's say it's us as a contractor picking it up. Well, it's perfectly acceptable because you're just going to go back through stage 3 again. Or the other thing we commonly hear is something that we would all view as being needed to be resolved during stage 3. Oh, don't worry about that, you can sort that out in stage 4. Well, no, that's not right, because you're reversing back into stage 3. So to me, it's being confident over your stage 3.
Absolutely. I think primarily, I think we need to get the stage 3 design better. I think that needs to be at a point where it can be then developed rather than has to be changed.
Agreed.
But also clarity on what information is expected from the designers during stage 3 and 4. Some of this information may evolve during stage 5 because construction will tweak some of the values. But if you make it clear for what values the design consultants need to enter, and then because information will vary, you have information looks like simple during design, it will evolve during construction. When it comes to operations, then you have a massive data set. So you cannot expect it to be the same along the process. It will evolve.
Is anybody aware of something called a construction control plan? I was told about that last night. This is a new stage or new thing that you've got to do, you'll have to do. And I think it might answer your question, Mark, because the construction control plan is there to manage change, I believe.
Yeah, but I suppose what we're talking about is not needing the change in the first place, isn't it? It's being confident over our stage 3. I mean, what we have is we have an internal document which is a stage 3 checklist, which has 600 points on it, which we use to assess the completeness of the stage 3, and that's how we adjudicate on a tender, and whether or not we think we're actually, there's a lot of risks there, there's a lot of boxes not ticked, and we're actually going to need to allow to revisit elements.
Yeah, EIRs don't make it clear where information is coming from, and there's usually gaps on how it should look like as well. Then you struggle to get clarity on this. That's why it ends up during construction becoming a bit of a mess.
George, I think that I'm just conscious of time. That I think the change control strategy is something that I read and included in that change management. It talks about what does a change control strategy look like, and apparently it's something that is noted as being submitted as part of the construction control plan, submitted Gateway 2, which goes back to, I think, what we were saying before, that it's sort of leaving room for ambiguity or change, which sort of undoes everything that we're talking about, is what we're trying not to do. So
your change is your change required because, in the view of a number of people, you didn't complete stage 3 correctly, therefore change is required, or is the change required because someone actually just wants to do something differently, change the system or whatever?
Yeah, but the ambiguity starts from the standards. You open the ISO 19650, there is ambiguity in the standards as well. It talks a lot about information management, but it doesn't make clear who does information management and what does it entail. It is too vague. Then, as George was saying in the beginning, it opens room for interpretation when it should be crystal clear. And I think the main problem is that it tries to address a house to a mega development, and it doesn't work. I think it should be broken down in different natures or different scales of jobs.
So George, just to wrap things up, in terms of the, I guess, because I think a lot of the things that we have talked about, we have crystallized together in the work stream questions. I don't know whether it makes sense for, I don't know, for us to talk separately about them and see how do we, who might be best to tackle, which parties might be best to be involved in that. But I can do that with you later, I guess.
I think that's something that we should do. I think I've found this a very, I'm sorry if I've dominated it, but I think I've found this extremely useful, this meeting, and the level of interaction suggests to me that people are very keen to move it forward. So maybe what we do, Gaz, is set up another session, maybe break it down into a couple of separate work streams. So maybe looking at the data and the process, maybe, I don't know, just an idea. We run.
I think I'm conscious keeping it in the mind of the design, by stepping back into the delivery, the change, and the kind of scope, or the kind of almost kind of stepping away from the nitty-gritty data for a little bit, because that's something they've been doing in the workshops. Yeah. But if we step back to the kind of high level elements that are going to drive all of those things, like if you can't get the procurement to work, if you can't get the change management to be done, then the data element becomes a bit secondary. So I could, I guess if anyone, maybe we could do that next session. I guess if anyone's got any further thoughts on the questions I raised and issued a couple of weeks ago, I can reissue them again today, just so it's sort of higher up in the inbox. Then that would be probably the best thing to do.
I think so, and I think, I mean, certainly I've not done anything with your questions, Daz, and
No, that's fine.
I think we need to, though, don't we?
Yeah, I think we need to reach some agreement, and we probably haven't got
Yeah.
long enough to do it now. But maybe a more targeted session just to,
Yeah.
to go through each of those and agree as a group that they can move to the next stage.
Should we try and set something up for a couple of weeks' time or something like that?
Happy with that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I'll also I think this idea of being able to look at how we can capture the sorts of things that Matt was discussing earlier, and that work on ontologies. I think that's something I think that we can draw from the follow-ups from DCW, because what we're hoping to do, what we're hoping to do is run the DCWs virtually. Yeah, so take on the next stage and then say, let's take that particular the scheme and let's see how we can, whether we use that one or another one or whatever.
Well, I think it would make sense to continue with your student accommodation and your door scenario, because it is, if you keep using that as the constant through
exactly.
looking at the REBA stages, or from a procurement point of view, or from a change management point of view, there's so many elements in and around that door that I think it captures the major sectors, i.e. the architectural designers, the specialists, the M&E, etc. That it will kind of capture everything, and obviously then you've got a really nice story around this one door and the kind of wall that it sits in, for example.
Yeah.
And that can be the datum that procurement is tested against, that specialist input is tested against, etc., etc. So I think I think it really makes sense to kind of keep that scenario that you've already started and keep testing that, because if you can't get a door to work, then obviously we've got bigger problems.
Jarek, are you okay with that?
Yeah, sorry for being quiet today, but yeah, perfectly okay. And if you could, Daz, if you could send that email, I will definitely comment. I wasn't typing away something else. I was actually typing your comments, kind of summarizing them. I posted them in a chat, by the way, so I did pay attention.
Alistair, you've been quiet, but Alistair's from Hilti, and I think therefore has a very significant bit to play in this whole thing, because he's, you know, a subject matter expert in that area. Have you got any observations, Alistair?
Yeah, like everyone else, it's an information overload. I'm thinking it from the manufacturer's point of view in terms of this is the kind of thing that we can be doing. How can we make the job easier in terms of getting the information across? Because I agree with your point earlier on.
Alistair, you're very quiet. Put your mic down.
Sorry. I'm thinking it from a manufacturer's point of view and thinking in terms of presentation of material. You're right in what you're saying, George, earlier on in your presentation. As manufacturers, we have very different ways of presenting material, and in fact, even when you showed the test report from Exova, we actually have several test reports from Warrington, Exova, whatever they're called these days. And even within the space of 2 years, we have 3 different formats of fire test reports. And then if you extend that even further to the other notified bodies, they even have a different way of presenting these things. I think this is where things are getting it is getting difficult. Is trying to be able to pulling everyone together to a common standard, to make things machine readable, to make things easy to interpret, to try not to eliminate the human element of it. I know that sounds terrible, but yeah, I think from a manufacturer's point of view, I think there's a lot that I think there's probably a lot of things that we can do, and I've certainly taken copious notes to feedback, even just our technical marketing team, to say, look, I think there's ways in which we can help in this to provide information, and even in terms of what we're doing with BIM, we're looking at different, for want of a better expression, plugins that can be used on BIM, existing BIM models, where the model can actually be populated with the correct products, the correct information, so that it then will progress on to the stages that we want to achieve. But because for us, we're not just looking at the BIM model, we're actually looking at how can we actually interrogate the BIM model on site. Because and this is just a small plug, because one of the things we're looking at is augmented reality, and how you can actually, during the construction phase, inspect what is actually being built and look at it and have it compared to the BIM model, so you can actually do a progress check on the construction to make sure that things are actually tying up, and not have something that's right. Are we looking at something which is representative of the BIM model? So rather than wait to the end, it's something you can actually do as a progress check.
Alistair, I think one of the important things with that is that you need to look at that in a holistic way.
Yeah.
And probably you are. So let me, if I just explain what I mean by that. There's a whole range of new technologies that are coming in, very cool technologies that are doing augmented reality. And what they're doing is they're looking at all of the elements that need to be checked. What I think we have to be careful of is doing something that simply would look at penetration seals.
Well, yeah, I mean, our main focus obviously is what we're looking at is in terms of what we can contribute, and it's the whole issue of services and service penetrations. It's not just penetration seals. It's actually looking at how they're supported and how they're actually being fixed up and put in place, and it actually uses the BIM model information.
I guess what I'm saying is that let's make sure that when we implement this type of thing, that it can be used in a way. We can do this through APIs. In fact, we're now, as Active Plan, we're now looking to deliver our applications as part of other applications.
Yep.
So we're building already. We've built APIs into Revit, so that within Revit you can access all of our applications and the data, and that's our direction of travel.
Okay.
Because then it means that then, you know, if for example, you know, somebody's using Viewpoint or they're using Field View or BIM 360 Field or something like that to do inspections, then they can still get access to the rich data and also the functionality, but within their platform, or within the platform that they're using elsewhere. I think that's really where we should be going. I think otherwise we're just ending up at Digital Construction Week. There's so many different software companies all doing the same thing. It must be very confusing.
Yeah.
George,
I mean,
just to say quickly here that there is a risk of having families a library that has too much information for stage 3, for example, and that you wouldn't commit to at this stage. So if users download it and realize that there's too many parameters that they don't know about or information included there that they wouldn't have, they may decide not to use that family just for that reason.
That's why, Eduardo, as you know, I would always recommend that you hold the data outside of the family itself, and then it means that you can then present back just the information that is needed for that particular purpose at that time. You can always pull it into the Revit family. That's the approach that we've taken. We've made it so that using the Revit API, we can leave the data in the database, or we can put it into the model. But you don't have to have it in the model, because, as you say, you end up with you know, something, for example, for fire collars that's maybe got, you know, 50 different attributes against it. and you know, people would only fill in 3, whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, that's good. Thanks, George.
George, yeah, I'm conscious of time now, so I've got to jump off to another meeting myself. So would it be possible, I don't know whether Chis, you could help in terms of just setting up the next meeting,
yeah,
specifically to go through the 3 questions that we've raised and generated, just so we can agree that the action for the work stream is correct. So as I say, if you maybe put a call out to see if anyone's available in 2 weeks' time, you know, 2 Wednesdays' time or something similar time,
yeah,
we can start from there. That'd be great, Jess. And then we can take it from there. But yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I want to just sort of again say thanks for everyone. Thanks, George, for really useful feedback. And yeah, see you in a couple of weeks, I guess.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tas.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yes,
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.